Good day. It was the 1980s. The NES had exploded onto the scene and had single-handedly revived console gaming with an epic lineup, great controls, and amazing graphics. And for many, it reigned supreme amongst all gaming consoles. But foreshadowing the future console war between the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, Sega attempted to compete with the NES Goliath. It of course attempted to compete with the Sega Master System. Now technically this was a slightly superior system when it came to specs, but its main downfall was its lack of great games. In all reality, just about anybody can name 5 great NES games. Ninja Gaiden, Super Mario Bros. 1, Super Mario Bros. 3, Contra, Journey to Sulius. Whereas if you try to name 5 great Sega Master System games, you might have a little bit of trouble. Really, when I think Sega Master System, the first game that comes to mind is Phantasy Star. Now, while the Sega Master System did not actually have a lot of standout titles, this game here, however, more than makes up for that. This, of course, is an RPG. But this was an RPG released at the time when 2 other mammoth RPGs were released. The legendary Dragon Quest, which was released in 1986, that single-handedly popularized console RPGs as a whole. Really, prior to this game, RPGs were rather difficult affairs that had about 14 different keys just to open up a bloody door. With this game, you had a fairly basic menu and 1 button. And then, in 1988, the same year that Phantasy Star was released, we had Final Fantasy. And I really don't have to explain how important this game was, but Phantasy Star deserves more exposure than it actually gets, because Phantasy Star is actually the superior of these early RPGs. Phantasy Star is essentially a basic JRPG, but what it does well. Mainly because it actually has a fairly unique setting, especially for the time. And while the gameplay is of course a basic turn-based system, it actually has an actual story that's more than just rescue the princess. So let's actually take a really close look at how great Phantasy Star actually is. As stated earlier, Phantasy Star is a basic JRPG. You control your character on an overworld and you get into random battles, whereupon you basically throw your numbers at the enemy until the enemy dies. And of course, like with Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, you usually get some kind of gold reward at the end. Although sometimes in this game, when you open up the treasure chest, it will explode. Now, the turn-based battles are also like Dragon Quest in that you face them from a first-person perspective. Now, since the Sega Master System was somewhat more powerful than the NES, the enemies you face actually have more frames of animation than the ones in Dragon Quest. Essentially, in Dragon Quest, it was just a static image, whereas here they'll move about a bit. Now, in this game, you primarily just grind out levels and gold so you can go and buy good weapons and things of that nature. Difficulty for the game is extreme. You're gonna be dying all the fucking time. You would better bloody save every couple of steps, because you can get into a fight with an enemy and they will savage you. And this happens pretty much all the goddamn time. Even if you have the best armor and the best weapons, you run into some enemies, especially those goddamn Draculas. That's not their actual name, but I bloody well like to call them fucking Draculas because that's what they fucking are. Who know there are so many fucking vampires on this goddamn planet? They can kill you quite quickly. It's amazing. And all they do is just sort of roll up in a fucking ball and scissor kick you in the fucking face, but still, they will kill you all the goddamn time. When you see these, either try to fucking run away or be ready for the fight of your life. Now, one of the most important aspects of this game is the fact that you do have party members. You, of course, had party members in Final Fantasy, but you did not in Dragon Quest. And your party members will, in fact, be very necessary to actually continue in the game. Mainly because this game is much more story-focused than Dragon Quest or even Final Fantasy. You actually have a named character here, and she, yes, female representation in games way back in 1987. She is known as Alice. Her brother is killed by the evil empire, and you have to try to topple the evil empire and get revenge for your brother. Now, in order to do this, you have to, of course, grind out all those levels and eventually fight a boss at the end. Now, you eventually get several party members. I'm not going to spoil them all, but I will talk about several. You have, of course, Odin, who is basically kind of a fuck-up. Why? Because when you find him, he's trapped in stone, and you have to figure out how to get him untrapped. And then, of course, you have your talking cat character, known as Meow. Although, when I first actually read it, I called him Mayu, and then I thought of Peter Mayhew, the actor who played Chewbacca. But that need not detain us at the moment. Both characters are fairly powerful, and they actually have an impact on the story. Really, the best aspect of this game is the story and its setting. It has a science fantasy aesthetic. You, of course, can use swords and potentially laser guns, and of course you can travel on space rockets. That is awesome, to say the least. The controls for the game are actually pretty bloody good. The menu system is easy to navigate, and overall, you never actually have to fight the interface to play the bloody game. And this is actually pretty amazing, considering the fact that the Sega Master System had a grand total of 2 buttons and a D-pad. The thing didn't even have a bloody start or select button. Hell, to pause the game, you actually had to pause it on the bloody console of all things. The sound effects and music of the game are quite simply excellent. Now, while some of the attack sounds are actually kind of basic, and are basically just beeps and bloops, the music is, in a word, exquisite. One final thing to note is the fact that the dungeons are handled a bit differently than in both Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. When you go into a dungeon, you actually go into a first-person mode, which is actually very unique both for the time and for many years later. And the first-person effect actually looks halfway decent. Overall, I highly recommend Phantasy Star. You really don't even have any excuse to not play it, as you can actually just download the bloody ROM quite easily, and the Sega Master System emulator is, of course, runnable on just about any bloody thing. The game is a masterpiece. And sadly, it's an unsung masterpiece simply because it was on a system that had no hope of competing with the NES juggernaut. So in any event, this is General Lotz wishing you good Phantasy Star 2 and good Phantasy Star Online, or whatever makes you happy.